When it comes to land, Montana is one of the biggest states in America. It's the fourth largest state overall, and it sits only behind the well-known big three American states of Alaska, Texas, and California. Montana is even larger than Germany is in terms of area, but it's vastly smaller when it comes to the size of population. Because for all its huge amounts of space, Montana's a pretty desolate place. As of 2023, the entire statewide population is only about 1,140,000 people, compared with Germany's 84.5 million people. To put in an even greater perspective how empty that makes most of Montana, there are fewer people who live here than in the state of New Hampshire, a state that is about 16 times smaller than Montana is in terms of land, and a state which is at a similar northern latitude at the top of the continental 48 US states. Montana's average population density statewide is thus only about 2.9 people per square kilometer, which is the third lowest density in America after only the notoriously empty states of Alaska and Wyoming. And that makes Montana one of the most sparsely populated locations in the world. If Montana were an independent country, it would be in the top 4 lowest densities in the world, right in the company of countries like Namibia, Australia, and Mongolia. Consequently, there aren't really any big cities or even towns to speak of in Montana. Of the top 5 largest settlements in the state today, only Billings has a population in excess of 100,000 people, and even then it just barely does at 117,000 people, as of 2023. And then going even further, all of the US states around Montana are pretty much just as desolate and empty as well. To the east, there's North Dakota, which is about equivalent to Washington state in geographic size, but which only has about a tenth of Washington's population, despite them both being at about the same latitude at the top of the continental US mainland. North Dakota is thus the 4th least densely populated American state right after Montana, with only about 4.4 people per square kilometer on average. And just like Montana, North Dakota doesn't really have any big towns either. Fargo is the only settlement in this state with a population in excess of 100,000 people. And just like Billings in Montana, it only barely surpasses that threshold with only 131,000 people as of 2023. And Fargo is barely even located in the state at all, because it's placed over in the extreme east of North Dakota, literally right on the border with Minnesota. And then there's also South Dakota, which is extremely sparsely populated as well, with about the same overall population density as North Dakota. There's only about 900,000 residents who live within South Dakota. And so, just like North Dakota and Montana, this state has very few large settlements as well. The biggest city in the state is Sioux Falls, with only about 202,000 residents as of 2023. And just like Fargo up in North Dakota, Sioux Falls is barely even in South Dakota because it's located in the very far southeast corner of the state, right on the borders of Iowa and Minnesota. Going west from Fargo or Sioux Falls, the vast majority of the Dakotas are almost entirely empty of people. To put the scale of their emptiness into even more perspective, the populations of North Dakota and South Dakota combined, even when including Fargo and Sioux Falls, is about completely equivalent to just the population of Manhattan in New York City, an island that is geographically 6,420 times smaller than the Dakotas are, but which has about an equivalent population. And then of course there's also Wyoming to the south of Montana, which is America's emptiest state after Alaska and the least populated state in the country, despite being the 10th largest state by area. The entire state has only 581,000 residents as of 2023, and the biggest town in the state, Cheyenne, has only 65,000 people living there, which means that Wyoming doesn't even really have a proper city. This whole part of the center north of America, consisting of Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, and parts of Nebraska and Idaho, is by far the emptiest, most sparsely populated region of the continental 48 US states. North and South Dakota combined equals the population of Manhattan, while Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Idaho all combined equals the populations of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island combined, without even factoring in the additional population of the Bronx. New York City alone thus has a population larger than all 6 of these geographically large states do combined, with more than 1 million people left over to spare. But what's perhaps the strangest part about how empty this part of the middle of Northern America is that immediately across the border further north into Canada, where you'd expect the climate to be even harsher and colder and the population to be even smaller, it's actually dramatically larger and a lot more densely populated instead. Alberta's population is nearing 4.7 million people today, nearly as much as all of Montana, both of the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Idaho all combined, which further makes Alberta more than twice as densely populated as Montana is, despite both of them being interior landlocked regions and Alberta being much higher north in latitude. Alberta's also got dramatically larger cities than any of the US states do further to its south, such as Calgary and Edmonton, which are genuinely big metropolitan regions, with populations of 1.64 million and 1.54 million people respectively. Calgary alone has about the same amount of residents as North and South Dakota do combined. despite being located way further north and remaining inland. While Edmonton has much more people than the entirety of Montana combined, despite being located way further north, more than 300 miles further beyond the Montana border. Edmonton is thus the furthest north city in the Americas, with a metropolitan population of more than 1 million people. But it and Calgary aren't even the only very big cities that can be found north of the most empty part of the continental 48 US states. There's also Winnipeg in Manitoba, with a population of about 840,000 people, which dwarfs any of the American settlements further south in the Dakotas or Montana, and is far more people than live in the entirety of North Dakota combined. And then there's also Saskatoon and Regina in Saskatchewan. With 342,000 residents, Saskatoon is bigger than any other city in Montana, the Dakotas, or Wyoming, while even Regina, with 250,000 people, is big in comparison to Montana and North Dakota standards further to the south. Seeing the big picture, the top 5 biggest Canadian cities in the internal Canadian prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba are vastly larger than the top 5 biggest American cities are further south in the internal Montana, Dakotas, and Wyoming. And the reasons why the settlement patterns developed in this seemingly counterintuitive way here in the North American interior are incredibly complex and fascinating. South of the US-Canada border, there are many reasons why Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming became the emptiest part of the lower continental 48 states. It is an area that is almost entirely west of the 98th meridian line of longitude, the imaginary geographic line that roughly divides the wet and humid environment of the North American continent in the east from the dry and arid environment found in the west. Nearly anywhere east of this line in the United States, farms can rely more on natural rainfall and less on artificial irrigation, which means that in a broad sense, food can be produced more cheaply and in greater quantities that can sustain larger population bases. At the very frontier of where this line cuts across the continent and divides the wet east from the arid west, you can find a nearly perfect trail of frontier cities straddling the divide immediately before everything becomes arid, like San Antonio, Austin, Fort Worth, Oklahoma City, Wichita, Lincoln, Omaha, and the aforementioned Sioux Falls and Fargo in the Dakotas, and Winnipeg further north in Canada. East of this line in these frontier cities is the overwhelming 80% of the entire American population, and west of it is the remaining 20% scattered across only islands of dense populations in between vast and largely empty distances in places like Denver, Albuquerque, El Paso, Salt Lake City, Boise, Tucson, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and the heavily populated but narrow US West Coast. This is the result of numerous geographic and climatic factors all working together that shapes where people are actually able to live in the North American continent. The gigantic western mountain ranges comprising the coast, Cascades, Rocky, and Sierra Nevada cleave off only a narrow strip of coastal plains and valleys in the western sections of California, Oregon, and Washington that are more or less directly exposed to the incoming winds and moisture blowing in from the Pacific Ocean. When those moisture-rich Pacific winds impact the towering mountain ranges, though, they release most of their moisture as precipitation on the westward-facing windward side before they reach over the mountains and blow down on the leeward side without that moisture as dry winds. This is why the western halves of Washington and Oregon exposed to the Pacific receive so much more rainfall than their eastern halves do on the opposite side of the mountains. And it's why the cities in the west of the states like Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland were able to sustain more agriculture and support larger numbers of people than the cities over on the leeward side of the mountains where the environment is a lot drier, like Spokane, Yakima, or Bend. The eastern half of the United States to the east of the 98th meridian receives moisture-rich winds blowing in from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic, but the moisture they carry usually fails to penetrate into the continental interior any further beyond the 98th meridian, which is why everything between the 98th meridian in the east and the coast, Cascade, Rocky, and Sierra Nevada mountain ranges in the west is so dry and not great for agriculture without extensive irrigation practices. Montana and Wyoming, along with a vast majority of Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, fall precisely within this range of the United States where it's already very dry. And then on top of that, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming all have large stretches of their territories that are dominated by the Rocky Mountains, which complicates their abilities to develop large urban areas even further. And then even beyond the Rockies in the eastern parts of Montana and Wyoming, and within the entirety of the Dakotas and Nebraska, the lack of big trees, hills, or mountains, and the vast expanse of mostly flat plains and prairie means that the dry winds blowing through here don't have very much friction to slow them down, and consequently, it's also one of the windiest locations that can be found anywhere on the planet as well. So basically, the environments in this part of the United States are dry, arid, rugged, cold, and very windy. And beyond the significant Bakken Formation in North Dakota, where large amounts of shale oil was discovered and capitalized on only recently since the 2010s, no very large amounts of resource wealth have been discovered or capitalized on within these American states either. which is why historically they were never as extensively developed as other, more ideal settlement locations within the United States were first, and why they largely remain sparsely populated to this day. But further to the north, right across the border in Canada, the historic, geographic, biological, and geological factors have all been just different enough to make it a much more densely populated region than either Montana or the Dakotas today. You see, when the first European colonists began coming into and settling the modern-day lands of Canada hundreds of years ago, they experienced several geographic realities that determined where they were able to settle that continues to directly impact where all 38 million Canadians live today. What's probably the single most important geographic feature of Canada that's determined where Canadians have lived for centuries is the Canadian Shield, a vast expansive area that covers nearly half of the country and which constitutes the largest mass of exposed Precambrian rock that can be found anywhere on the planet. Across the Pleistocene epoch from about 2.6 million years ago to only about 12,000 years ago, the Shield was the center of the vast North American continental glaciers that slowly, over 2.5 million years of time, advanced ever southward and scraped all of the land across it bare of its overlying soils and minerals that were mostly pushed to the south and southwest of the Shield. As a result, the land across the Shield today consists mostly of exposed, jagged bedrock with at best only a very thin layer of topsoil above it, which makes it all largely useless to carry out any large-scale agriculture in. The landscape is riddled with lakes and rivers, and building any infrastructure across it is prohibitively expensive, because mostly everything has to be drilled or blasted into the exposed rock. The Shield does have valuable mineral wealth though, so it is still useful, but because building and sustaining settlements within it is so challenging, the largest settlement that can be found anywhere across it today is the mining town of Sudbury in Ontario, and it only has a population of 166,000 people. When you overlay a map of the Canadian Shield with Canada's modern population density, you obviously see that it's about a perfect match, with nearly all Canadians today living beyond it. So when the first European settlers came to colonize Canada, they obviously encountered the challenging to settle Shield as well, and so they concentrated around the very strategic St. Lawrence River region, which historically was navigable by ships from the Atlantic Ocean as far inland as precisely where Montreal is today, where a series of rapids exist that impair navigation any deeper into the North American continent for centuries. For all of that time then, Montreal was the deepest internal city in the northeast of the Americas with a navigable link directly to the global ocean, which is why Montreal evolved into Canada's largest city for centuries until the 1980s, when it was finally surpassed by Toronto, a large part of which had to do with the development and final opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway project in 1959, a series of locks and canals across the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes that artificially overcame geography and finally opened up all of the Great Lakes to navigable access to the greater ocean, around the rapids due west of Montreal, which transformed interior cities like Toronto, Detroit, Chicago, and even cities as deep into the interior like Duluth, Minnesota, into truly maritime port cities with direct access to the ocean. Before that became possible in 1959 though, Canadian settlement was crammed in around the navigable section of the St. Lawrence River between the impossible-to-settle Canadian Shield in the north and the Great Lakes and Appalachian Mountains to the south, which eventually coalesced into the United States. The large bodies of water in the form of the Great Lakes here also help to absorb and radiate heat around them, which moderates the climate around them and keeps the region more temperate than they otherwise would be, like the significantly colder environments further west beyond the lakes at the same latitude in Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana. So, with rich soils for agriculture, navigable waterways to the ocean extended even deeper after 1959, and crammed in between the Canadian Shield to the north and the United States to the south, this narrow corridor between roughly Quebec City in the north and Windsor in the south, encompassing Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and London in between, evolved into the core of modern Canadian civilization, and it continues to remain the most densely populated and most heavily industrialized part of the country today. The corridor is home to more than 18 million people today, which is more than half of all Canadians. But as Canadian civilization developed around this geographically small core, the vast and open expanses of Western Canada remained largely unsettled and undeveloped until the mid-19th century. Compared to the American West from Washington's perspective, the Canadian West from Ottawa's perspective was far more isolated and more challenging to physically get to. The prairies in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta were separated from the core of Canadian civilization by more than 1,200 kilometers of the barren Canadian Shield, running through nearly the entirety of Ontario. The western coast of British Columbia could be reached by ships early on, but the towering Cascade and Coast mountain ranges blocked off any easy access from the immediate coast any deeper into the Canadian prairies from this direction as well, which made the prairies in central Canada Canada difficult for the Canadian government to access from just about every direction. But as American settlers began expanding westwards into the continental United States and started building out railroads to bring in even larger numbers of settlers, the Canadian government felt the pressure building to start sending their own settlers out west as well, to finally begin populating their western provinces with Canadians, before they ended up being looked at and potentially settled first by Americans. Several Canadian expeditions were sent out to survey the lands of the Canadian West in the mid to late 19th century, with one of the earliest being the Palliser expedition between 1857 and 1859. That expedition came to the conclusion that Western Canada beyond the Shield could be broadly divided into three separate regions. A cold, coniferous forest region in the north covered by boreal trees and peat bogs that was too inhospitable for agriculture. Another region in the south that became known as Palliser's Triangle, that's essentially a semi-arid steppe biome and an extension of the vast American Great Plains. And most interestingly, an extremely rich and fertile but narrow band in the center between them that was perfect for settlement in between the coniferous forest in the north and the semi-arid steppe of the south that became known as the Aspen Parkland region. As it so turned out, the Aspen Parkland developed over time as an extremely unique competitive ecosystem, where the flora of the evergreen trees and peat bogs to the north of it have spent centuries fighting for ecological dominance against the flora of the more grassy and arid plains to the south of it. The Aspen Parkland region stretches out in the center between these two biomes in a narrow band no wider than 150 to 300 miles, extending from almost immediately where the Canadian Shield ends in western Manitoba, before arcing northwards through central Saskatchewan and then on into central Alberta, while another disjointed, separate segment of the Aspen Parkland known as the Peace River Country exists further up in northwestern Alberta, which is the northernmost land in Canada that's actually suitable for agriculture. The Aspen Parkland region was defined by deciduous trees, meadows, and wetlands, and hardly any of it extends any further south into the United States. And because of this very rich mix of trees, meadows, and nutrients from the wetlands, the soil found within the narrow Aspen Parkland region is literally some of the richest and the most fertile that can be found anywhere on the planet. The soil that developed within the region is a preciously rare black type of soil known as Chernozem that is renowned for its high moisture storage capacity and high amounts of natural fertilizers like phosphorus and ammonia. Extremely high agricultural yields are possible with Chernozem soil because it requires little external inputs like irrigation or fertilizer. And as it turned out, the highest concentrations of Chernozem soil that can be found anywhere in the world are in Ukraine, which had long been regarded as the breadbasket of Europe, and right here in central Canada in the Aspen Parkland arc running through Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. After figuring all of this out, the Canadian government began building out its own railroads from the core in the east, cutting across the Shield and penetrating into the newly understood fertile lands out in the west. As more and more of the trees and meadows within the Aspen Parkland belt were cleared to make way for more farmland, more and more eager settlers from Europe and the United States began taking the journey to settle there. And well aware of the similarities of the soil and climate between this part of Canada and Eastern Europe, the Canadian government even began sending out migration recruitment officials to the Ukrainian and Polish lands of the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, in order to entice experienced farmers who were sick of oppression from the Tsars and the Habsburgs to leave their old lives behind and start a new life as a settler farmer in Canada, with virtually free land where their talents could be more or less identically duplicated. Tens of thousands of them accepted the offers, and this is largely why today, Canada has the third highest number of ethnic Ukrainians in the world after only Ukraine itself and Russia. Between 1896 and 1914 alone, more than 2 million settlers from Europe and the United States decided to leave their homes and start a new life in the hitherto mostly empty Canadian prairies, an event that continues to represent the largest wave of migration to Canada in the country's entire history. Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, and Winnipeg were all founded within and around the Aspen Parkland belt and its signature Chernozem soil type that enabled this region of the country to become the breadbasket of Canada. Huge amounts of crops like wheat, oats, and barley are grown here today, while large numbers of cows and sheep are raised within the more arid Palliser's Triangle region. Consequently, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta account for more than 85% of Canada's total amount of arable land, which means that, probably unsurprisingly, more than 80% of Canada's total agricultural output comes from this region of the country as well. Simply put, the agricultural potential and output of these more northern Canadian provinces is vastly higher than the American states further to the south, like Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming, largely because of how ridiculously rich and fertile the soils found in the Aspen Parkland belt that arcs across them is. Moreover, the barren Canadian Shield isn't just entirely contained within the borders of Canada either. It stretches down to cover nearly all of northern Minnesota beyond Minneapolis, along with much of northern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan as well, which severely limits the ability for settlements in this part of the United States to grow as well. Winnipeg is mostly such a big city in comparison to anything south of it in the United States, because it sits immediately where the Canadian Shield ends and the Aspen Parkland Belt begins. And it's got abundant freshwater resources immediately to the north of it in the huge Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba. Winnipeg thus became the most obvious location for the Canadian railroad companies to build the central logistics hub at between the rich farmland of the prairies in the west and the population and industrial core further in the east, right before the almost impossible to develop anything in Canadian Shield begins. But the true explosion of the population up here in the Canadian prairies wouldn't begin until much later on in the mid-20th century for another completely different reason. Because in addition to having some of the richest soils that are found anywhere in the world that enable mass agriculture, it also turned out later on that the region has one of the largest deposits of oil that can be found anywhere in the world as well. By the early 1940s, Calgary and Edmonton were already fairly large towns numbering in the tens of thousands, but they weren't anything huge. While Alberta and Saskatchewan had nearly identical populations overall. People had known that there was oil in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin for centuries before that time, but the true extent of exactly how much oil was there wasn't really well understood. A few oil wells had been constructed around Calgary between the late 19th century and 1946, but production was fairly minor and inconsequential on a global scale. In 1946, Canada only produced 21,000 barrels of oil a day, mostly from this area immediately around Calgary. But Canada was simultaneously consuming roughly 10 times that amount of oil that they were producing. And so the vast majority of Canada's oil supply, like around 90% of it, was all being imported from the United States, who was the world's largest oil producer back at the time. But the year 1947 would suddenly set a chain of events in motion that would irrevocably change that reality forever. As in February of that year, after more than 130 previously failed wells and millions of dollars of sunken investment, the Canadian oil company Imperial finally struck it big with the successful drilling of Leduc No. 1 immediately to the south of Alberta's provincial capital, Edmonton, which represented the first very major conventional oil well ever dug in Canada. More successful wells were drilled over the years that followed, which confirmed the existence of a truly massive oil field being present in Alberta. And then, literally billions of dollars in investment money all came pouring into the province to pursue even further production. A massive demand for jobs in the energy industry in Alberta suddenly exploded almost out of nowhere, and as more and more people came to the province in pursuit of those energy-related jobs, the more service-oriented jobs catering to the energy industry population kept getting created as well, leading to even more demand for even more transplants and even more immigrants. Within only a single decade from the discovery of Leduc No. 7, the populations of Calgary and Edmonton roughly doubled, while the population growth rate of Alberta as a whole has been consistently in the double-digit percentages every single decade ever since. Alberta went from having about an equivalent population as Saskatchewan did in 1946 to having roughly quadruple Saskatchewan's population today in 2023. Since the Canadian oil industry initially began with wells focused around Calgary, nearly all of the Canadian energy companies maintained their headquarters and offices in Calgary, and most of them kept them there even after the larger oil fields were discovered further north around Edmonton. And since Edmonton was already Alberta's political capital, and so it was the largest city anywhere nearby to the new massive oil discoveries that were being made, Edmonton became the site of most of Canada's oil hardware and infrastructure like refineries and processing facilities, and it became a major hub of pipeline routes. And then, in addition to the province's relatively large amounts of conventional oil, the truly colossal oil discoveries that cemented Alberta's position as one of the entire world's most significant sources of energy were subsequently made in the province's more unconventional Athabasca oil sands to the northeast, north, and northwest of Edmonton. Unlike conventional oil fields where the oil is already a liquid that can basically just be pumped out from beneath the surface just like it is, the Athabasca oil sands in Alberta are massive deposits of bitumen, which is an extremely heavy form of crude oil that's more of a semi-solid, semi-rock form of crude oil mixed in with materials like clay, sand, and water. As such, extracting and refining this form of crude oil is more complicated and more expensive than more liquid conventional oil is. And so, the Athabasca oil sands in Alberta didn't begin being commercially commercially developed until the late 1960s. But over time, as extraction techniques evolved and made the process more efficient and cheaper, production out of the oil sands continued rising, as did the demand for jobs. And as it turned out, the sheer scale of the bitumen crude oil found in the Athabasca oil sands was vastly larger than anybody had previously believed. Together, the Albertan oil sand reservoirs contain an estimated 1.7 trillion barrels of bitumen in place, which, to put into perspective, is roughly comparable to the rest of the entire world's proven reserves of conventional petroleum all combined. Based on 2007 oil prices and modern unconventional production technology, the International Energy Agency has estimated that only about 10% of those reserves are actually economically recoverable, though. But that's still sufficient enough to boost Canada's total proven reserves of oil into being the third highest in the entire world, remaining only behind Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Bitumen production out of the oil sands in Alberta has since contributed to the province, producing more than 80% of all the oil in Canada, which has further enabled Canada to rise from being only a minor oil producer throughout the first half of the 20th century to being the fourth largest oil producer in the world today as of 2022, with even more oil production than Iraq and remaining only behind the big three of global oil: Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And because of the oil sands' geographic location in northern Alberta, wedged in between the towering Coast and Cascade Mountains to the west and the Canadian Shield further to the east, it was easier to construct all of their oil pipelines running south first into the United States, then mostly all run down to America's heavy crude refineries on the Gulf Coast around Houston and Louisiana. Houston and Calgary thus essentially evolved into the Jupiter and the Saturn of the North American energy industry. The vast majority of the oil production in Alberta has always been sold and exported through these pipelines down to the US market, and the Albertans managed to sell so much of it to the Americans that Canada has risen to account for more than half of America's total petroleum imports now as of 2022, which has simultaneously made Canada the fifth largest oil exporter in the world. This, in turn, has meant that vast sums of oil money has been flowing into Alberta for decades, which has transformed the province into the wealthiest part of Canada on a per capita basis. The 2021 nominal GDP per capita in Alberta was 84,505 Canadian dollars, or about 62,000 US dollars, which is by far the highest of any of Canada's provinces, and is more comparable to American states like Florida, and it's a GDP per capita that's significantly higher than that of Montana or Idaho further to the south. The oil money that has come pouring into the province has been used to dramatically develop and expand Alberta's schools, highways, and hospitals, which has boosted the province's Human Development Index or HDI score to being literally the highest in all of Canada. The HDI is a comparative measure of things like literacy, education, personal income, life expectancy, healthcare access, standard of living, and overall well-being of citizens that is compiled by the United Nations. And with a score in 2021 of 0.955, Alberta not only receives the highest score in all of Canada, but the highest score in all of North America as well, with a greater HDI than any of the 50 American states. In fact, the only three places in the entire world that have clocked a higher HDI score than Alberta are Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, and then that's it. Which means that Alberta is just a pretty great place to live, which has attracted even more people to come to the province. So, ultimately, because of their proximity to the rich and fertile soils of the Aspen Parkland Belt, and their proximity to the massive Athabasca oil sands and their good rail and air connections to the rest of Canada and the United States, and because of the very high quality of life that's present there that has followed, the Alberta-Edmonton corridor far to the north of the US border has evolved into the second most densely populated region of Canada, remaining only behind the old Quebec-Windsor corridor itself in the east more than 2,600 kilometers away. The Calgary-Edmonton corridor has since become the home of more than 75% of all Albertans, or a little more than 3.2 million people, which is greater than the population of the greater Vancouver metro on the Canadian West Coast, and is roughly equivalent to the combined populations of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming further to its south. And that is all why the Canadian population further north of Montana and North Dakota is a lot denser than the American populations are further to the south. Now, something that I've begun to notice about myself is that despite being a very busy person, I always seem to have small little gaps across my days that I end up filling by browsing through the recent news on Reddit, TikTok, or Twitter. And while that's fine in small doses, I also usually find myself believing that I also don't have enough free time to do certain things that I really want to do, like learning more about how our complicated world actually works. And that's why I'm such a huge fan of this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Learning new things, especially new complex things like STEM subjects, is often pretty tough to do without having a bunch of open free time to dedicate towards it. But Brilliant designs these fantastic interactive courses on STEM subjects that are broken down into all of their smaller bite-sized chunks, so that you can genuinely fit learning something very useful into literally any schedule, from casino probability to computer science to logic, and so many others. And again, the courses are legitimately well designed so that you're actually engaged the whole way through. And you actually learn stuff along the way, since they break really big concepts down into their intuitive base principles, and then bring them back together again progressively as you go. I find it so satisfying to learn something new and interesting, especially when it's something that I never could have possibly imagined actually having a firm grasp on before, like calculus, electricity and magnetism, or astrophysics. Basically, if you're the kind of person who enjoys challenging yourself to learning new things, Brilliant is definitely the right fit for you. So you should go right now to brilliant.org/reallifelore, or click the button that's here on your screen right now to try out everything that Brilliant has to offer next completely for free for a full 30 days. And best of all, the first 200 people to follow that link or click that button will also get a further 20% off of Brilliant's annual premium subscription. It's a great way to help support real life lore and learn something cool at the same time. And as always, thank you so much for watching.